start today with James, the first chapter, verses 19 through 27. My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. For people's anger does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. Therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word planted in you, which can save you. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like a man who looks at his face in a mirror, and after looking at himself goes away and immediately forgets what he looks like. But the person who looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues to do this, not forgetting what he or she has heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. If anyone considers himself or herself religious and yet does not keep a tight rein on their tongue, they deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. Religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, keep oneself from being polluted by the world. Sisters and brothers in Christ, the Word of God. Thanks be to God. So it's happening. The rockers of my generation, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, now as they're getting older, guess what? Because of all the rock music that they were around, guess what's happening to them? They're going deaf. They're losing their hearing. But it's not just the rockers of my generation. It's also, shockingly, the classical musicians of my generation as well are starting to lose their hearing. Was listening to an NPR story this week, and there was a story about a violist who, after years of playing in the Boston Symphony, was starting to lose her hearing. In fact, was severely losing her hearing. Because you know what? Whether it's heavy metal, or it's classic rock, or it's classical music, or anything else, your ear doesn't care what it is. If it's loud and it's up against it, guess what happens with the decibels? You start to lose your hearing. Some of you might say, Ryan, it might not just be because you're around loud music. When you start to get older, I got my bifocals this year, some of those senses aren't as good as they used to be, right? But this violist, because of years of playing in the symphony and years of having this wonderful music that was all around her, she was slowly in her 60s losing her hearing. And she feared it. She was gifted. She knew Bach cantatas by heart, and she played in many areas of Boston and all over the world. But this violist, who was just world-renowned, accomplished, she was starting to lose the hearing. At first, she could compensate. Then she started to wear hearing aids, but she didn't want anybody to see her wearing the hearing aids. For what would the others think if she had to wear hearing aids? Would they think she's hearing the notes correctly? So she would only wear them in rehearsal, so that she could hear the conductor's notes. Then one night, she wasn't wearing the hearing aids, and she was performing. And she was performing in a classic church in Boston. And there was a soloist, and the conductor was conducting. All of a sudden, she realized she was losing even more, and she couldn't hear. But the conductor was conducting, and as a trained musician, she could follow the conductor. And even if she couldn't hear everything correctly, because she had played the Bach cantata many, many times, it was part of her, right? And as long as the conductor was conducting you, she was fine. Except one thing happens when you have a soloist. Sometimes the conductor drops out, and the soloist takes over. Because the soloist takes over, the symphony is directed to follow what the soloist is doing. Except the soloist is singing here, and where is the orchestra? Behind. And so she couldn't hear what the soloist was doing. And all of a sudden there was panic. There was fear that was setting into her as she couldn't hear what the soloist was doing. But she knew the Bach cantata. She was able, being a gifted musician, to figure out how to stay on with the notes. She would watch all the movements of the bows to make sure she was still in line with all of the notes that were going on and with the soloist. Well, after that fearful experience that had given her anxiety, guess what she did? She decided to quit. And after that night, she quit. She was with some friends. One friend knew she was quitting after what had happened. He had known about her hearing loss. And he said, let's celebrate this moment. Let's take a moment. She quit for 3 years because of her fear of how losing her hearing would affect her playing. She just walked away from music. Except guess what? That was no way for her to live. Those of you who have music as a big part of your life, could you imagine just walking away from it and not having it be part of it? That's the same for many of us who have something that's such a part of us. Yesterday we had to give them to eat missionaries with us. That is such a part of certain people's lives in our congregation. Could you imagine just walking away and giving that up? And there's so many other things. Giving things up is hard, and when you give them up, you lose a little bit of yourself. Because she was so fearful that she wouldn't be able to play at the top levels as a top-level violist, she just gave it up. But she realized eventually she had to face her fear, and she didn't need to just give up the music. She needed to continue. She needed to get those hearing aids. And eventually, after 3 years, she did. And she found her way back into playing with others and giving the gift of music to people who aren't always into classical music, but found beauty in her story and what she was doing. We've been studying how to live unafraid with courage and hope. Fear can just plague our lives. It's those false events appearing real that just stop us from fully living as children of God who we're called to be. And some of our fears, they're legitimate. The fear of losing your hearing and how that would affect the violist playing was legitimate. But when we don't face our fears with faith, when we give in to our fears, then we don't live as God has called us to live. Then we don't live the full lives God is calling us to live. We don't live as James calls us to live. James says, those who are following Christ are set free to live the perfect law of liberty. What does he mean by living the perfect law of liberty? He means because we've been set free by the cross, by the resurrection that we are celebrating in this season and the Sundays of Easter, because we're set free by that gift, we can now live, we can take risks, because God has won it all for us with the resurrection of the cross. And we can risk loving, as the first scripture said, loving with action, not just with our words. We can be, as James calls us, not just hearers of the word, but doers of the word. We can be people who practice true religion, risking to care for the least and the lost, the orphan and the widow, as James would put it in his time, reaching out to those who are lonely so that they don't have to fear being by themselves. We don't have to live in fear. We have the resurrection. We don't have to live in fear. We're set free by grace to live the perfect law of liberty. We don't have to live in fear because God goes with us even when we fail, even when we're rejected. He goes with us by his grace to go out and live the perfect type of religion, care for the least and the lost. Hamilton writes in his book that successful people themselves have to overcome fear. Fear of failure, rejection, fear of not succeeding like the violist, fear of being lonely. I'm sure these are fears that maybe have plagued you because these are top-level fears. Hamilton says when he goes to preach, this is the preacher of the largest United Methodist church in the country, he still fears that it's not going to work out. He even tells the story of one week, preaching the largest United Methodist church. He tells the story in his book. One week as he was greeting people as they were coming out, one person just said to him, "You are a horrible pastor. I don't know how you can preach that. Totally reject your message. You need to do better." He said, "Oh my goodness, there was rejection. What could I learn from that?" I was sitting there thinking to myself, "Oh my goodness, someone said that to Adam Hamilton?" Whatever the case is, right? That was, oh my goodness, he tells a story and it was rejection. Could he fear that that would continue to happen and not continue to do his mission? Because one negative can really send you on a tailspin if you let it in your head. No. He had to face his fear. He had to realize that he could learn something from that criticism, because we all can learn something, because criticism can be a gift. And he had to realize that he needed to attack his anxiety of not always giving the right message or being perfect. He had to attack that anxiety with action and then release the things he couldn't care for to God. Hamilton has 3 pieces of advice that he's gained over the years for us to be able to face down our fears so that we can live unafraid with courage and hope. And the first fear that he calls us to face down in this section of what we're studying today is that fear of rejection and failure. I have that fear. Fear of failure and rejection. And then when that fear takes over, even just in my head and not out here in the real world, it stops me from fully living the way I should live, from acting the way that James calls me to act, to be a doer of the word and not just a hearer, to do what 1 John says, to let my actions speak also about my love just my words. So how do you overcome the fear of rejection and failure? Well, the first thing you got to do is this. Realize that most things are never as hard as you fear. And so if you fear rejection and failure and messing up, you need to go ahead and do what we said last week. Attack that with action. And realize that when you start doing it, it's usually not as hard as you feared. And even when you fail or you reject it because it was maybe too hard or you just weren't able to accomplish it or you learn from that, the pain of that failure or that rejection or not succeeding because it was hard and you needed to learn a lesson, whether you received criticism or you said, look, I failed, but I'm going to do better next time, the pain of that failure almost never ends up being as painful as your worry. Let me say that again. The pain of failing almost never ends up being as painful as your worry. See, the worry gets you all anxious. You can feel inside. You get all worked up. It's like the violas. I'm going to fail. I'm not going to be playing. This is a world-renowned Bach cantatas and viola, and she's worried she's going to fail. This is Adam Hamilton, world-renowned preacher, and he's worried he's going to mess up. The pain of that is usually more than what ends up happening when you do fail. And by the way, when you do fail, you usually are called to learn something from that so you can succeed the next time and be an even better doer of the word, not just hearer, to live that perfect law of going out and serving Christ. The second thing he got from Franklin Management course is this. This is how you overcome the fear of failure and the fear of rejection. Successful people, however you define success, because Jesus would define success not that he gained all the world's riches, but that he helped and served God and ushered in the kingdom in his work. Successful people, however you define success, are willing to do the things that unsuccessful people are unwilling to do. Fear keeps us from being doers of the word and not just hearers, as James encouraged us to do, from living the fulfilled life. Successful people, however you define success, are willing to do the things that unsuccessful people are willing to do. We Methodists know that in order to be successful in sharing the gospel, making disciples for the transformation of the world, of loving, knowing, serving, and sharing God, we know that we Methodists are called to mission and service. We can't live in the fear of the false events appearing real rejection, that we'll be rejected or that we'll fail. We are bound and called by Christ and our understanding of grace, especially sanctifying grace, to be active participants in God's activity in the world through mission and service. The Give Ye That to Ye missionaries we met last night, Ann and Miguel, they are called from their comfort zone, from where they were serving in Nicaragua, to now go to a new place to serve in Mexico. They can't let fear, the fear of the unknown, the false events, the things, the worst case scenarios that might spin in their minds, they can't let that dictate their lives. They have to let being a disciple and being an active participant in God's activity through mission and service drive their life. Love of God. If we're going to live like the 1 John passage says, where it's just not words, but in action and truth, love of God is always linked to not living in fear, but living unafraid with courage and hope, to love neighbor, even the neighbor that's different than me, that thinks different than me, and to be compassionately committed to seeking justice and renewal in the world. How do we overcome fear of rejection? How do we overcome fear of failure? How do we overcome the fear that if we fail or rejected, we'll be lonely and not have friends? We have to realize that most things are never as hard as we fear, usually, and that the pain of failure never ends up being as painful as the worry. That successful people are willing to face their fears. It's like we're going to say at the end here. When you face your fears with faith, you attack your anxieties by action, and you release your cares to God, that you are able to be successful because you're willing to do what others are unwilling to do because fear paralyzes them. We then are successful in seeking and being missionaries for God. What's the final piece of advice that Hamilton gives? The final piece he calls discernment by nausea, which is what he says literally means those things that when you realize God's calling you to do and you really don't want to do it because that fear and that anxiety is just building up in you, but you know that it's the right thing to do, or you can take this other path which seems easier at the time, but this path gives you a little nauseous. That's discernment by nausea. It says God's trying to provoke you to do that thing that's uncomfortable because you are called to do the harder thing for him. When we fear failing, we fear at times displeasing others. We fear that we will be left alone. We fear that we'll receive criticism or biting words. We fear these things, these false events, even if they haven't happened. And they might happen. But even if they haven't happened, we spin them into the worst case scenarios in our heads, and it stops us from being doers and hearers of the word. So with those pieces of advice from Hamilton in mind, where successful people are willing to do the things unsuccessful people are unwilling to do, where we realize the pain of failure is never as great as the worry about doing the thing that we fear doing, that false events appearing real is overtaking us. And when we realize we've got to have that discernment by nausea, that we're called to do the hard thing, and on the other side, it is going to be a deep blessing when we do it. How, for the book of James, then, are we called to go forth and live? And this is where, if you want to, you can turn to the sermon notes in the back of your bulletin, and they're also going to come up on the screen to give us some advice on how to live. The first thing is to go back to what we learned last week. We must, in order to have fear not paralyze us but transform us, we must face our fears with faith. That's where you realize that the worry you have about failing and rejection or being alone is greater than actually going out and serving God and reaching out to the one who's alone. That we need to examine our assumptions in light of the facts. Usually our assumptions, if we think about it, don't face and match up to the reality. Nobody ever completely fails at everything. There is a gift that we all have that we're called to share. We need to attack our anxieties with action. Don't let fear of failure, rejection, or being alone or friendless stop you from acting in love, as 1 John calls us to do, and being doers of the word, not just hearers. And then, when there's things we can't change in this world, they're just too big, like we talked about in other weeks, the fears of violence, because the fear of violence can stop us from doing things, and then we fail because we were fearing that the worst could happen. We need to release the things we can't control to God. Then, when we do this, we will be people who face our fears. And this is coming up on the screen now. We'll be people who face our fears with faith. It means attacking our anxieties. This will come up on the screen now. It means attacking our anxieties of cultural loneliness, or biting words. Instead, we'll be doers of the word and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. Our top fears in life can be failure, rejection, loneliness, receiving criticism, displeasing others. We can't live and be paralyzed by those fears. We have to instead realize that the worry about those fears is often, and the pain from that is often worse than if we do fail when we go out to do something or to reach out in service and mission to God. That successful people are willing to do the things unsuccessful people are unwilling to do. That discernment by nausea, it's the hard road, we don't want to do it, it's going to cause us to be uncomfortable. We might receive criticism, someone might reject us, someone might not be our friend anymore, but realize there are other friends and other people around the corner to be with us. And finally, I want to leave us with one thought, and one thing that I think we can do to help conquer our own fears, to live fully as doers and hearers of the word, to live in that perfect law that James talks about, to conquer our own fears, to live unafraid with courage and hope, and also to help not spread fear. Because the other thing we can do is we can spread fear. We can be people that, if by our anxieties and our negativity, we can start to spread fear to others. When we can really be people who attack fears, attack anxieties with action, and release our cares to God. And that's simply by taking this verse card into your bulletin this week and hanging it up and memorizing this. Adam Hamilton gave this out when there was lots of criticism. Criticism can be a gift. I need criticism in my life. I need not to fear it or fear failure. I need to receive it as a tool so that I can improve and be better and analyze things that maybe I'm doing right or not doing right? We don't need to see criticism and fear it as something to hurt us, but instead something to improve us, to be better doers and hearers of the word. But also, too, when we want to give criticism, or we want to give words, and we need to watch out for our own biting words we can give. Because people can fear us not being pleased with them, or rejecting them, and fear that we won't be their friend anymore. I think that's happening a lot. Gee, if you think differently than me, or you have a different opinion than me, or you look differently than me, or you disagree, or you even have some criticism of me, that somehow that means we can't be friends. I don't know how that started. Do you know how that started? I don't know how that started, but it seems to be prevalent that we can't have a disagreement and our friendship must be 100% the same. How did that start? We got to stop it. We got to attack the fear of saying, if I disagree or criticize you, I'm no longer your friend or your brother and sister in Christ. That cannot be. So we can help end fears ourselves. We need to realize that we've got to attack our anxieties with action, but let's help others do it as well, that they can release their cares to God. And this is how we can do it, by following the advice of James at the beginning of the passage today. Let